Viego, the Ruined King, one of the most iconic characters in League of Legends. But despite his importance, there's a surprising lack of quality. Let me show you why. Viego relies heavily on basic attacks, yet he is one of the newest champions with only 2 attack animations. That is pretty underwhelming. What is worse is that his attacks are each packed into a single animation, meaning he doesn't have separate animations for the outgoing attack, motion, and the return to the idle position. Let me show you what I mean. Let's take Yone, for example. Yone has his basic attack split in one initial outgoing motion, like this one here called Attack 1, and then an animation that ends the basic attack and returns the champion to their original position, this one called Attack 1 to idle. Basically, they are 2 animations working together into one. This, in my opinion, is an underestimated and overlooked detail that significantly affects the feedback of smoothness and fluidity a player experiences during gameplay. On top of that, while Viego only has 2 attack variants each with only 1 single animation, Yone instead has 4 attack variants, each with 2 animations working together as one. That's a lot of visual variety during gameplay, and it helps champions to look more realistic. This one here is his 4th basic attack animation. Let me show you so you've seen them all. Now let's get practical. Try to pay attention to how smoothly Yone's basic attacks weave into each other. There, you see? Perfect harmony. It's so satisfying to both watch and play. Okay, so this is his base attack speed, so it's easier to keep track of his movements. But let's try to increase his attack speed value. Notice how stopping each attack still looks and feels balanced? That's because, while his outgoing attack animations are affected by the attack speed changes, his attack to idle animations maintain the original speed and keep balance to his overall posture. This also impacts on him auto-attacking while moving. Look at him, it's so good. He looks like he's dancing with his blades as he cuts down his target. I must say Riot did a very good job with Yone. And now, let's check out Viego. At face value, stopping his basic attack seemingly returned him smoothly to his idle position. That's because for now, I'm keeping him on his base attack speed value. Ugh, I really have to say again how outrageous it is to see an auto-attack based champion, like him, only have 2 attack variants. Like, I could understand if he was a mage and his gameplay mostly revolved on abilities. But again, Viego is a melee skirmisher, and basic attacks are a big part of his kit. Incredibly, he has an attack to run for each of his attack variants. The attack to run animation is basically the attack twiddle I've been explaining you, with the exception that it's when the champion is moving. That's all, really. Let's speed things up a little. Notice how his movements are way more jagged compared to Yone's? There, look. When I stopped him during his crit attack animation, look! He didn't even play any return to idle animation. The 3D model just forced itself to go back into idle. Overall, because his attack animations are single-packed, the way he repositions himself feels too sudden, unnatural. Viego also lacks something that in my opinion is pretty basic and essential. Something even an old champ like VGU Tristana has. The run slow animation. This animation triggers when the champion is affected by movement speed reduction abilities. Look, even a champion as old as Braum has it. Well, I'll let you know that Viego has none. He literally just keeps his base walk animation instead. There's plenty of visually compelling animations he's missing. I'm not strictly talking about essential stuff. Even if most players don't care or don't want to notice, I think it's important that if just one champion has it, then every other champion should have it. If you introduce a champion with a new animation for getting slowed or stunned, new animations for when you walk or run or home guard, then why when you release the champion that comes next you just forget to give them the same animations? It just makes no sense. And mind you, even things you might think are trivial still contribute a lot to command feedback. Since I still have some clips from Yone, let me also show you the difference with Home Guard. See how he smoothly enters the animation, and how he has a specific animation for stopping the Home Guard running? He looks and feels so good. They even gave him an animation to transition from Home Guard to base running. There, see? Now, about Viego. Well, let me say this first. Rather than hovering around like the King of Darkness he is, possibly lifted from the ground by the black mist or something, he just runs looking like a shoplifter. But besides my personal taste, the problem is that his Home Guard, as well as his walk and run animations, all three share one single stop animation, in this case called idle in. There's another feature I want to talk about. Some champions, like Khada, have alternative toggable forms they can enable and disable at will by simply pressing Ctrl 5. Khada can literally toggle her symbiotic armor on and off whenever the player wants during the match. Look at this. It looks so badass. Like, if I played Khada, I'd walk around the rift with her default face, and once I'm close to enemy champions or about to engage in battle, I'd toggle the mask on. It would feel like I'm manually entering combat mode. Isn't that cool? This is a special emote only a handful of champions have, but let me show you why I think Viego should have one. Also, since we are here, it's worth noting how despite Khada was released 3 years before Viego, she has one base idle animation and 3 idle variants, while Viego has one base idle animation and only one single variant. With time, you'd expect the number of animations to increase, not to decrease. Right? I mean, I would. Anyway, back to us. Although I'm sure not many people know, Viego also has an alternative form. It's called Wraith Form, and it toggles whenever he enters his black mist. This means that it's not manually triggered by the player, but supposedly serves the purpose of champion spell effect readability. Needless to say, waves and waves of Viego players still went and asked Riot to implement his Wraith Form into a toggable emote. Because, let's be honest, it's too cool not to be. But after significant insistence, it was promptly dismissed by Riot because of the visual purpose it was tied to his E ability. And I mean, that's fair, right? Like, design-wise it makes sense. But then, they released Soul Fighter Viego, which is his first, and for now only legendary tier skin. And guess what? No Wraith Form at all. Yep. Other epic skins would at least have a Wraith Form variations fitting the skin theme. They actually all have pretty cool Wraith Forms, to be honest. But Soul Fighter Viego? Nothing. Literally, nothing at all. Not only it's superficial, but it also conflicts with the statement they gave people who wanted the toggle option. And what sounded like an acceptable reason now feels like an embarrassing excuse not to put effort into making players happy. Viego is very lackluster in a huge variety of interactions when compared to many other champions released years before him. My favorite has to be how his weapon was released as an item almost 13 years ago, and yet he literally doesn't even bat an eye for it in-game. He doesn't say anything at all when he buys it from the shop. His weapon doesn't blink or change color after he buys it. Literally nothing. But you know who has something for it instead? Yorick. That's right, Yorick, a champion who received a VGU something like 9 years ago, who is heavily lore related to the Ruination. A champion who pledged his life, or rather his unlife, to undo the Ruined King. That's right, when you buy the Blade of the Ruined King as Yorick, he doesn't simply have 1 or 2 special voice lines for it. Nope. He has the goodness of 3 special interactive voice line variants for whenever he buys the Blade.
Return for it.
Then I will strike him down.
This blade has performed great feats.
And I will use it to undo them.
The sword of a great man.
The sword of a fool.
And you know what the funny thing is? He's a champ who doesn't even build it. And that's not the only voice interaction that Viego doesn't have.
Has destroyed a turret.
Everything that stands must fall. This journey is long.
Destroyed a turret.
Mortar crumbles.
There's actually plenty of champions, both older and newer than Viego, with turret destroying voice lines. There are also other kind of voice interactions that Riot didn't even dream of providing for Viego. Some of them are voice lines for engaging dragons and Baron Nashor. Even Yorick himself has them. I mean, Yorick is designed as a top laner and has jungle-specific voice lines. You would at least expect a champion designed as a jungler like Viego to have them too, no? Well, nope. There are other voice interactions I want to show you. This one is Kane's voice line for entering the jungle.
Stainless fetid swamp with their blood.
This one here is for moving in the river.
Wait by the river long enough, and the enemy dead will float by.
He's got one for engaging Scuttle Crab, too.
Such a waste of time.
Even Ezreal, who is an attack damage carry, has jungle-specific voice lines.
I always know a shortcut.
And him too for stepping in the river.
And my boots are not waterproof. Fantastic.
The ones I showed you are just one example each, but I want you to know that Kane and Ezreal, together with many other champions, have an average of 4 voice line variations for each context. It's a lot, and it's good. And want to know how many voice lines Viego, a champion specifically designed for the jungle role, has for entering in the jungle, walking in the river, or attacking jungle monsters? 0. Yep. He literally has none. And while I understand his main focus is ranting about is old all the time, you could still make it work in each context. I don't know, Isolde, this Krug reminds me of you. Isolde, I miss wandering the woods with you, or Isolde, this Scuttle Crab looks like your mom, and so on. You get what I mean, right? Another kind of voice lines I want to show you that Viego doesn't have is this one. Basically, when a champion meets an opponent for the first time, even if they are not related to each other's, they still have a generic interaction.
It does not work. It is not brethren.
You're the #1 contender? I must have really cleaned out the division.
Can't wait to write a song about this moment.
We have no enemies, Aphelios. Only those fated to meet us in the night.
Viego only has a first encounter voice line only with very specific and lore-related champions, and it's still only 1 sentence per encounter. Do you think this is a lot? This is Aatrox's first encounter interaction list. Can you even believe the amount of care and love they gave him? It's insanely good. Not to mention, for champions Aatrox is directly involved with, he has 3 to 4 dedicated voice lines. Unlike Viego, who only has 1 voice line only for that handful of champions he deigns to speak to when he's not talking about Isolde. Look at that list. It's crazy. Aatrox doesn't strictly have a relationship with many champions because he's an ancient being. Yet, being a global threat to Runeterra, he does indeed interact with characters from all over. Shouldn't that apply to Viego as well, given the scale of impact the Ruination supposedly had on Runeterra? There, he even has special interactions with champions labeled from specific regions or types. Imagine something like this on Viego. The amount of voice interactions champions have is so vast that I'd take 1 hour just to show you all of them. Like, Can you believe Swain has almost 30 voice lines adapting to whether or not his team is even ahead or behind when moving alongside his allies? Not to mention skin-specific voice lines like Dragon Master Swain. Yeah, apparently Riot doesn't do them anymore. Anyway, let's calm down a little with voice interactions now. There are some small considerations I want to do before I end the video. It's not a rule, but there are a handful of champions that, rather than having 2 movement animations for before and after buying boots, they have dynamic animations that adapt to enemy proximity. The ones I'm talking about are Aatrox and Yone. Aatrox and Yone only have 1 single animation for walking, but here's the thing. When they engage in battle, they change their stance completely. Look, here is how Aatrox normally walks around when no enemies are nearby, whether he's with or without boots. He looks so badass, by the way. I wish Viego also sticked with his pre-boots walking animation only. He also looks very badass. Until he buys boots, then he starts looking like a hunchback gremlin. Anyway, look what happens when Aatrox approaches an enemy. Isn't that visually incredible? I mean, this is top-notch champion quality design and execution. He even has different adapting animation for whether or not his passive is on or off. And look, when he walks away from the enemy, ta-da, he sheaths his sword back. Just awesome. Bravo to Riot for what they did with Aatrox as well. Yone is not as complex, but nonetheless visually compelling. This is how he normally walks around the rift, doesn't matter if he bought boots or not. And then, when he attacks an enemy unit with basic attacks or an ability, he enters a sort of battle stance. See how he changed into a more aggressive stance? And when I walk away, he returns to his standard run animation. Silky smooth. On a similar note, I was thinking, imagine Viego walking around with his base walk animation only. All of a sudden, an enemy approaches. If the player wants, he can toggle the Wraith armor on for extra badassery. Or not, you know. I'm not saying you have to. And then, Viego summons his blade. And just like that, ready for combat, he has his animation and combat stance. And if you're worried about King Viego, know that Sanctity, aka the Blade of the Ruined King before, well, it became Ruin. Still had the power to be summoned out of thin air. If you've read the Ruination novel, you know it's canon, and it'd make sense. I think it'd also be good to just remove the horrible gremlin run animation Viego takes on after buying boots. Since the blade is very light to handle, proof of this is how he just swings it around as if it was a pocket knife. There's no reason for him to walk around with the sword on his back as if it was some kind of tree trunk or whatever. Lastly, and I promise we are at the end of the video, I wanted to point out the rendering of his crown and sword meshes. I know most of you will think, but the game is not meant to be looked up so close. And I know you're right, but even from the intended distance, it's easy to notice how poorly Viego's crown was rendered. It literally looks like a cheap plastic green Barbie crown put on his head. Design-wise, the crown is supposed to be his most distinctive icon. It's a ghostly fire crown floating above his head, and it's the symbol of his power of possessing foes. In-game, when Viego uses possession on an enemy, a crown appears on his head. Now that is what I call a ghost crown. The effect looks amazing. And while I understand it's this big for ability visual related purposes, couldn't we have a mini version of it to put on top of Viego's head? And the sword? The Blade of the Ruined King, ladies and gentlemen. On top of the ghost light looking too rectangular when zooming in, what is this texture? I mean, texture. What texture? There's no texture. It's just a color. The original sword has so many details, such a level of polishing. Even in the cinematic they released to announce Viego, after he summons it, the sword fades back to a physical palette similar to his armor. It still maintains the same level of care as the original sword. What's the reason behind having it look like a Christmas tree all the time? They could have made it gain some kind of spectral visual effect once Viego would buy the real thing off the shop, which would also be a very nice interaction. But definitely nothing as superficial as this if you ask me, because it just looks like they forgot to add any texture at all and just lighted up the same color as his plastic crown set. In conclusion, I have no idea if Riot has a scale of importance for which champions get more than others. But for a champion as deeply rooted in League of Legends lore as the Ruined King, who's been injected in the narrative fabric of Runeterra and is responsible, and part of many other champions' background and events for more than a decade, Viego deserved way more than what they gave him. In my opinion, though, a priority scale shouldn't even exist to begin with. As a successful multi-billion-dollar company, Riot should set quality standard checks that each new champion should pass before release. No exceptions. Like, if you release a champion with 20 new animations for a total of 50 animations, why you give the next champion only 15 total animations instead? Why? If you release a champion with a total of 30 minutes voiceover, the champion you release after that only has 8 minutes of total voiceover instead. Why one champion you released 3 years ago has 100 interactions with everything in the game, trees, birds, lore, enemies, friends, river, dragons, anything. And then, the champion you released yesterday barely even repeat his 4 sentences without context. This is my biggest community project video, and despite my criticism, I did it because I live and breathe League every day since 2011, and Viego is my favorite champion. I just want the game to be good, to have some romanticism in it, some passion. I want the universe of League of Legends to go beyond a simple marketing strategy. That's all. If you watched the whole thing up to this point, my God, that's a miracle. Thank you for your perseverance.